Hi there, welcome to week 4 of the pain management program. This is the psychology part of that. There'll be a second video uploaded relevant to week 4 as well, to do with diagnoses. So you're watching this video presumably because you aren't able to attend week 4 in person this week. As always, hope things are okay for you, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person next week. But for now, though, we'll go through the content that we would have gone through, or we will be going through this week in the group, and you can hopefully not miss out on too much by watching this video in your own time. What I would say is throughout the video, I think a really important part of these sessions is the group discussion, but as much as possible, we're going to get you thinking along similar lines by encouraging you to pause the video at certain points and to have a look at what's on the slide and take the time to have a think about how that answers some specific questions, have a think about how that material might apply to you. Again, really encourage you to do this. That's how you're going to get the most out of these videos and these sessions, and thinking about how you can implement these techniques between sessions. So yeah, really definitely encourage you to pause at those points and hopefully get the most out of the day. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little more about thoughts and feelings. I know that when we spoke, whether or not you were here in person or had a look at the video of week 3, or perhaps it's week 2, I think, then we will have already discussed the importance of thoughts in how we respond to pain on an emotional level, on a physical level, on what we do, on a behavioral level. And also we'll have thought about the impact that all of that can have on our pain experience. So tuning into our thoughts is a really important part of the picture. This is a little bit of a recap about the structure which helps us to understand why that's so important. So we can see here we've got the situation in the background, this blue box, and the situation can be something external, like whatever it might be, an interaction with another person, but it could also be internal, like noticing our pain, like being more aware of our pain than perhaps we were yesterday. So we've got the situation which usually leads to a sort of certain mental activity. We acknowledge that thoughts sometimes take the role, or take the sort of the guise of that kind of internal commentary. Those what we typically think of as thoughts, those that sort of what we might say to ourselves in the moment, but also thoughts can often take the form of memories and images that we might have. So it's worth tuning into that. And we can see in this example, this person's having the thought, "I'm not good enough." And unsurprisingly, it's impacting them on an emotional level. This particular example, this person's ending up feeling worthless and anxious. It's impacting their behaviors, so they're avoiding contact with others as a result of those thoughts and feelings. They might feel tired, loss of appetite in their body. Well, we can see from the diagram, the whole thing is reinforcing. They end up reinforcing that thought, "I'm not good enough," and can get stuck in a bit of a cycle. We can have those very similar cycles we often see activated in response to pain. So managing difficult thoughts. Well, a few weeks ago, we discussed mindfulness of our thoughts. So noticing, not trying to push away, not trying to ignore our thoughts, but also not getting hooked into our thoughts. We talked about a couple of techniques, didn't we? Telling ourselves or saying to ourselves, there's that familiar thought that I'm having. I'm having a thought that I'm useless. We talked about some other techniques, such as maybe noticing the story. Oh, I'm telling myself that story again. So I wanted to encourage you to pause the video for a second here and have a think about, well, how did that go? What did I notice? What have I been perhaps a bit more aware of over the past couple of weeks since we had that chat? Yeah. How did it go? How's the mindfulness been going? Did I listen to the talk and think that's something I want to make some time for, and then it completely went out of my mind because of other things? Did I really put some effort into the mindfulness, but found, you know what, some techniques are really much better than others, and some of these techniques aren't working for me, and maybe there were time barriers. How did that go? And, well, yeah, what can you learn from that? So yeah, would encourage you to pause, and we'd have a conversation in the group if you were attending the group today, about other people's experiences as well. Maybe take a moment to have a reflect on your own experience of mindfulness over the past couple of weeks. Okay, fantastic. Hopefully that's useful to have a think about that. So today we're going to have a look at we're back on the subject of thoughts, particularly automatic thoughts, but we're going to adopt a slightly different approach. We're going to actually adopt an approach or discuss an approach which is known as thought challenging. We'll explore that one. It might seem like an odd phrase to use. We're going to explore that in a little bit more detail together. We're going to talk about pain memories and how to manage worrying, especially in relation to pain. I think pain, alongside any other chronic physical health problem, it's very common that we might worry. How's this going to look in a year's time, in 5 years' time, or in 10 years' time? Often that can be a really quite significantly distressing sort of thinking style, that worry that comes up. So we're going to talk about that as well. Okay. But first, let's think about, so a bit of a refresher, I know from previous weeks. Think about what we mean by automatic thoughts. So they're a little bit like a narrator commenting on our experiences throughout the day, often out of our awareness. It's this kind of automatic mental activity that that crops up, that impacts how we feel, sometimes without us even noticing it's there. And we might tell ourselves, be quite unkind to ourselves. We might be used to hearing ourselves saying, well, you're a bit of a failure, without even really acknowledging that's going on. So our thought narrator comments on our experiences throughout the day. But as we started to acknowledge that narrator, so our mental activity has a bias on the world. So we're having those thoughts based on all of our experiences that have led us to here. What does this remind me of when I perhaps struggle to do something? What are my early childhood experiences related to this, related to pain, related to illness? How do I usually interpret these kind of experiences? What are my previous experiences of pain and illness? So all of these are going to impact those automatic thoughts that we have in that moment. And our thoughts directly impact how we feel emotionally. Of course, how could they not? If we're saying unkind things to ourselves throughout the day, of course, it's going to impact how we feel. Also impacts how we feel physically. And we've talked before about that fight or flight system being activated, the muscle tension, the release of cortisol that's associated with that, and how that links to our body's threat system. We talked about the relationship between all of that and our experience of pain. So it's really important in chronic pain that we do tune into these automatic thoughts and do think about, experiment with, how can I, once I've identified if that's where that's part of the picture, how can I do something differently here? So one thing about automatic thoughts is that they are individual to us. What happens is particularly when we're distressed, we tend to revert to what we call thinking shortcuts, particular thinking styles that are, a little bit like a shortcut, really. We try and make sense of the world. When we're distressed, we try and make sense of the world quickly. We make assumptions, we use shortcuts. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, that makes a lot of sense. If we're in a dangerous situation, let's go back evolutionary wise, not so great at my history, but let's go back 200,000 years or so. We're in a situation that's threatening. We don't really want to be carefully analysing all the ins and outs of the situation. We don't really want to be thinking about lots of different things at the same time either. We want to really be focused on the threat that's in front of us. We want to be making snap decisions rather than nuanced decisions. So these thinking shortcuts make sense from an evolutionary perspective. We'll have a look at thinking shortcuts in just a second. But in terms of negative automatic thoughts, I just put this picture in because I think sometimes it can be useful to have a bit of an image. This little fella sat on this person's shoulder, just kind of muttering away throughout the day. I think it'd be useful to ask ourselves, what sort of things is my gremlin saying? What sort of things is my gremlin reminding me of in particular situations? Okay. Let's get back to thinking shortcuts. So psychologists have identified some particular thinking shortcuts that often crop up for people. Again, this is based on how the human mind has evolved. These are ways we've developed to survive, to respond quickly to a threat. What happens is we make broad, sweeping judgments. We often ignore the nuances, and so sometimes when the threat is not immediate, then these thinking shortcuts can end up being very unhelpful. Let's have a look. And while I'm talking through these, I'm going to encourage you to think, to notice if you recognize any of these in your own thinking. So it's quite often when we're in distress that we'll fall into use a thinking shortcut called all or nothing thinking. Either something is safe or it's dangerous. Either something is good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable, perfect or terrible. So we tend to polarize our thoughts, and we might act in extreme ways because, again, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, but we're thinking in extreme ways. Either I've succeeded or I've failed. There's no middle ground. Another one is overgeneralization, making a sweeping judgment or conclusion based on one experience. I didn't get that job that I applied for, therefore I'm a total failure. And is an example. So believing an isolated event might become a pattern and repeat itself in the future. Again, all of these make sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we were confronted with something very dangerous, it makes sense that we might think, well, you know what, I'm going to overgeneralize. I'm going to assume that all of those similar situations are going to be quite dangerous as well and avoid those in future. But we know that these can become a problem. Another thinking shortcut that we often notice is labeling, giving ourselves or other people or our experiences a one-word label. You can see the example here is stupid, little sticky note there saying stupid. We might often see people with pain labeling themselves as a burden to others or as a failure. So these labels are usually fixed, quite extreme, quite harsh, and they stir up strong emotional responses. What happens when we put a label on ourselves, I'm a failure, is we stop noticing other aspects of our experience. Got two more to look at, jumping to conclusions, what sometimes people might refer to as mind reading. We assume we know what other people are thinking. Because that person hasn't answered my text message today, then they must not like me anymore. They must be upset with me. We jump to conclusions. 1 and 1 makes 3. You can see the example there. We make hasty judgments or decisions based on, frankly, often not enough information. We assume we know what's happening. We assume we know what other people are thinking. And the final one, which we see, honestly, very often, are these should statements. I should be doing this. I must be this way. I ought to. And it can work the other way, of course. I shouldn't be. I shouldn't ever behave that way. Problem with shoulds or shouldn'ts or musts is it can lead to fixed ideas about how we should be in the world, how other people should be in the world. So in the group, we'll have a discussion about this. I'm going to encourage you to think about this particular example. So let's read the scenario below and I'll read through it with you. And then let's see, can we identify any of these thinking styles that we've just discussed on the previous page? And how might that impact this person's thinking and how they're feeling? So let's look at Dave. So Dave was invited to a friend's stag do. Felt really important to him that he could attend, and he knew it would be hard work, but felt pretty good for the whole weekend that he was there at the stag do. And he had a good time. But then when he woke up on the Monday morning, his back pain was really bad. Dave's got to phone in work and ends up taking most of the week off. The thoughts that are coming up for Dave here are that he should have anticipated this situation. He should have managed it better. Dave ends up feeling stupid. And he's reminded of when he made mistakes at school previously. So I wonder what's going on for Dave in terms of those thinking shortcuts. I'm actually going to scroll quickly back as a reminder. Let's have a think. Well, we can see some labeling. Dave's definitely called himself stupid. There are definitely some should statements there as well. I should have known better. I wonder if there's some all or nothing thinking there as well. I'm going to encourage you to have a think about a quick think about those. But before you pause the video, I'm just going to encourage you to, as part of your thinking about Dave's situation, just reflect. Are any of these thinking shortcuts familiar to you? Do you ever fall into the trap of labeling, overgeneralizing, all or nothing thinking? I'm going to encourage you to pause the video here for a few minutes. Just have a reflect on the material we've already discussed. Have a think about Dave, but also, again, really encourage you to have a think about what kind of thoughts come up for you, particularly in relation to pain, what kind of thinking shortcuts you might be using there. Okay, fantastic. Hopefully you've had a chance to reflect. So I think personally, and in people I've worked with over the years, I think it's quite significant just noticing this stuff. And actually a really important first step, a really significant first step, is being able to notice, gosh, look, I'm having that thought again. I'm labeling myself again. I'm telling myself I'm a failure because I haven't been completely successful by my definition. And I think noticing it is really important. But there is some more we can do about it. Which is around challenging our thoughts. So we can ask ourselves some questions once we've identified that is a significant first part, but then we can ask ourselves some questions around that thought. A useful one is, what's the actual evidence for and against this? There might be some evidence for it, actually. I'm not doing what I was previously able to do. Yeah, there's some evidence there. But is there some evidence against this? Am I using all or nothing thinking? Is there in fact a grey area here? Am I doing quite well in some things, even though I'm doing not so well in others right now? It can be useful to ask ourselves, is this thought based on a fact or feeling? We talked about that sort of jumping to conclusions. Am I using what we call emotional reasoning here? Am I assuming because I feel embarrassed, then I must have done something embarrassing? Well, maybe I'm basing that more on a feeling than what's actually happened here. Really important question, which we're going to build on further on in next week's session or the week after that. But we can ask ourselves, what would I say to a friend in this situation? Not somebody who I want just to sort of get rid of or end the conversation, but somebody I care for, who I want to be honest and truthful with. Would I say to a friend, yeah, you've failed at that. Yeah, that means you're a burden to others. Perhaps I would say to that friend something a little bit more nuanced, a little bit less labeling them, and a little bit more like, you know what, you're in a difficult situation. You're doing the best you can. Am I assuming I know what others think? Is this thought helping or hurting me? And is there a more balanced way to view this situation? We're useful to ask ourselves, is there an alternative way of thinking about this situation? So once we've asked ourselves these questions, sometimes acknowledging to ourselves, you know what, there is a different perspective on this. It might be a bit hard for me to stomach right now because I'm used to talking to myself in a certain way, but maybe there is a middle ground, and maybe it is worth me acknowledging, you know what, I do okay in some areas, as well as so there are some areas I want to develop. What we also notice is some thoughts crop up quite often, and people might notice, sometimes I'm saying the same thing to myself across lots of different situations. when that happens, we tend to think that that might be more a general rule, not so situation specific. I must always put other people first. I must always do the best, be the best, be the best I can, or whatever it might be. Where those thoughts crop up often, we might have noticed, as I say, a rule for living, something that's a bit more less situation specific and more general. And we all have these rules for living. Again, they're based on values, how we were brought up. Sometimes these thoughts can be helpful. Uh, let's have a look at this one. It can be useful if we have a rule that says I should try and eat healthy food whenever I can. Probably most of us would agree. Yeah, not a bad rule to live by. I'm sure we all actually achieve that to different levels of success. But useful rule to have. Problem is when rules become rigid and when those shoulds and those musts creep in. So if we say I should try and eat healthy food when I can, great. I think we can all agree with that. But if somebody's rule sounds more like I must never eat unhealthy food, I must always eat healthy food, then we can see those shoulds, those musts, those absolutes, those black and whites could lead to a rule which is actually probably quite punishing, quite difficult to live by. The problem with very rigid rules is when something happens, like chronic pain, something comes along that means we can't live by those rules, then this can be very distressing because we end up not being able to live to those extremely rigid rules. We can end up berating ourselves. The thing about rules for living is that they are actually quite important to us. They're often people say, well, that's part of who I am. They're based on my values. I think we definitely wouldn't suggest that you chuck out your rules for living. I think it can be useful to reflect on them though. Where have those rules come from? Is it sometimes there are cultural values. I should act in a certain way, based on my cultural values. Sometimes they are come from family, the way we were brought up. Sometimes it can be really well-meaning. There's no blame here. And sometimes a parent giving us the impression you should always give everything 110%. That's probably come from a well-meaning parent who just wants the best for us. Maybe a parent who's noticed that we're not giving 110% at school, maybe quite the opposite, and they're really trying to encourage us. Again, we internalize those rules. Sometimes that rule can be helpful. Like I say, at school, maybe that was encouraging, that was motivating. Further down the line, though, these rules can cause problems, again, particularly when they're rigid. And if we have a rule, I must always give everything I do 110%, well, I wonder if that might be causing particular problems, particular emotional and behavioural responses to problems associated with chronic pain. We don't want to throw out these rules, but what we can do once we've noticed them is ask ourselves, can I be a little more flexible with the rule? Can I replace these shoulds with I'd like to, these musts with where I can, it's important to me? Can I go from I must always give everything I do 110%? Can I shift that rule to I'm somebody who likes to give maximum effort when I'm able to? And I wonder if that shift, we're not chucking out the rules, but that shift might mean we're able to be a little kinder to ourselves when we're not able to stick to those rules. I think if we want to develop that even further, we can say, what can I do to put this more flexible rule into practice on a daily basis? My previous rule was I must always give everything I do 100%, 110% effort. And my new rule is where I am able to, I like to do things the best I can. How can I put that into practice on a daily basis? Does that mean allowing myself to rest a little bit instead of really pushing on through, even pushing through pain? Worth a reflection. In fact, oops, we haven't added it here. Sorry, I'm going to go back. We haven't added it here on the slide, but I'm actually going to really encourage you to have a little pause here. Take a couple of minutes to think, I wonder, curious about those rules. See if you can notice any rules you have for yourself, helpful or unhelpful, doesn't matter for now, but it's going to be useful going forwards to notice if any unhelpful rules do crop up in response to pain. So hopefully you've given yourself a moment to think about that. Let's move on and talk about worries. It's very common with worries that um, things start off in having a sort of a basis in what's happening right now. The worry might be, my pain seems worse than usual, worse than yesterday. And lots of other everyday worries that I'm sure you can think of. What often happens, particularly when people are worriers or are anxious, is those worries link to a next one and link to a next one. We call this worry chaining. You can see the picture of the chain on the slide. And what happens is we often link those with future-based worries, things that haven't happened, things that may well not happen, but they're linked to that initial worry. And we end up, another way of thinking about this is a bit like a balloon. We end up with this huge sort of load of worry that's connected to an initial event which might not have been anything like as terrifying. Let's have a look at this example. The person notices, oh, my colleague seemed off with me today. And then the worry chaining, they start thinking forwards. What if I've done something to upset them? And then the next link in the chain, maybe that person's going to complain to the boss. And then the next link in the chain, what if I end up being sacked? And that can even lead to imagining themselves arguing their case in the employment tribunal. There might be another stage. What if I then can't pay my mortgage if I don't have a job? What all the problems that would lead to? How am I going to look after my children if I don't have an income? And so I wonder if this is familiar to some of you, a worry that starts off unpleasant but manageable, soon balloons into, a bit of a horror show. And we're having these real thoughts, images, and actually emotional responses, as though the thing we're worrying about, the other end of the chain, is actually happening. We're imagining ourselves not being able to put food on the table because we're unemployed, when actually all that's happened is my colleague seemed off with me. It can be worth noticing when we're worry chaining. But then also worth thinking about, here we go. Yeah, worrying is thinking about things that might happen in the future. And worry very often makes us feel anxious. With lots of worry, we end up feeling very anxious. We've talked before about the impact on pain. And worry can take on a life of its own, just like in this chain. So it might be worth thinking about, what kind of things do you worry about in future? Do you worry about your pain? Is pain often a trigger for your worry? So with these future-based worries, we can usefully divide them into what we might consider helpful, might seem like a strange way of describing it, but bear with me, helpful and unhelpful worries. We've got some examples here. Well, I'll talk about it first. I think, we can imagine helpful worry as a type of worry, the type of worry that is in response to a sort of something we can do something about. Let's have a look at these examples. My car has a puncture. How am I going to get to work tomorrow? Have a think. We usually discuss this in the group. You might be thinking, I'm not really too sure. Usually we consider that's a helpful worry, because actually that's going to prompt me to get the puncture fixed, or maybe to think about another way. Can I get the train to work tomorrow? Or what else can I do? Kind of useful worry, not particularly nice to think about, but it's going to spur me to action. But this one, and it might seem a bit laughable, but actually, it's very common that people do have these kind of worries. What if I randomly get a puncture on my way to work tomorrow? Well, not a lot we can do about it now. We haven't got a puncture right now, so I suppose I could check if the got a spare tire or whatever's okay in the car. But ultimately, this is just causing me distress, not helpful in any way. So we classify that as an unhelpful worry, I think. I'm not managing all the demands at work. Well, maybe not quite such a straightforward one. I would suggest that might be a helpful worry, because we might be able to say, well, I'm not managing. What can I do about it? You can put a plan in place. You might be speak to your boss, reduce your work demands, whatever it might be. Definitely classify it as helpful and do something about it. What if my pain gets even worse in the future? Well, understandable worry. but probably not a particularly helpful one because what are you going to do? There's no amount of worry is going to make that more or less likely to happen. What if I end up in a wheelchair when I'm older? Again, another very distressing thought, probably an unhelpful one. I can't pay the bills that are due tomorrow. Well, I can imagine that is quite helpful. Can I? And what can I do? Can I contact the company? You know, potentially quite helpful. So I think it can be useful to tune into our worry, like we have been over the past couple of weeks. Notice our thoughts, tune into our worry. What am I worrying about? What type of worry is it? Is this helpful or unhelpful? And then we can uh, respond to that kind of appropriately, really. So, what type of worry is it? Notice our worries. What type of worry is it? If it's helpful, can I do about it? And you know what? I might not be very comfortable in contacting those that the whatever energy provider and saying, you know what, I'm not going to be able to meet that bill deadline. Might be pretty unpleasant. Understandable that I'll be putting it off, but actually, if I get that phone call done, or if I plan to do it tomorrow after work and then make that phone call at that stage, then that's going to reduce the worry. That's something that's ticked off the to-do list. So with helpful worries, we can think about what can I do about it. But there's that other kind of worry, that unhelpful worry. Sorry, that hypothetical. What if I randomly get a puncture on the way to work? What if my pain is worse 5 years from now and even more sort of debilitating? I think when it's unhelpful worry like that, it's useful to notice it, notice what we're thinking, label it as unhelpful, and then either use some of the mindfulness techniques we've discussed, use distraction, and it might be useful to say, when I catch myself worrying about that, nice thing to do is go and talk to my partner, perhaps. Not even about that, just about their day. Might be that I find engaging in a valued activity is useful. When I have those worries, if I sit down and read a book that I enjoy, actually that helps. Noticing that unhelpful worry and not getting hooked by it and doing something different. So, to summarize today's session, the thoughts that show up in relation to our pain can play a significant role in our pain experience. We can choose to notice and try and respond differently to our pain. It does take commitment, but can make big differences in the long run. So, these techniques do take practice. And just to finish on, I'm going to encourage you to pause the video. This is where we just quickly have a conversation in the group. We talked about a lot today. I would encourage you to think about one thing you might take away from today. Take a moment to think about what that might be. And importantly, how am I going to make use of that? Maybe it's noticing and identifying my worry. Maybe it's noticing thinking shortcuts. Just really encourage you to take a moment to think about what was useful and how am I going to put some of this stuff to good use. And hopefully we'll see you. Hopefully you're able to attend next week and we'll see you there.